So yeah, thanks for everyone for coming. This is our July meetup, round two. So we obviously had one in June and this one's July. Definitely give us your feedback on whether these are working or not, because we've decided to do two this year post, obviously, or like going back in office and stuff like that. So we're finding our feet whether these are working or not. Just some updates of other things coming up. So we've now got a date for our August one. So it's the 14th of August in London, and it's like a delivery special. So that's all up on the website. So go have a look whether that's of interest. Then we're also going to have one in September in Manchester, and then we're going to have another one in London, which will be like a post symposium type event. So they're dates for your diaries anyway. I won't go too much into this. I'll let Corey say what the talk's about and obviously go into that and all the details. All I would say though is if you've got questions, fire them in the chat and we'll pick them up at the end. And you can also then like put your hand up towards the end too. So we'll monitor all that. And then just the final bit really is if you want to be a speaker in the future, give us a shout. There's a form to fill in or take a picture of that QR code. There are all the details. So again, if there's things on here and you want to share them, obviously use Twitter or X. And this video should be up on YouTube in the next couple of days as soon as we can get processing it all. So there are the bits from us. I'll just let one more person in. Wants to let me. Here with. Yep, right. What I'll do then is I'll hand over hosting to Corey.
All right, thank you. Where is the waiting room? Is it in the Okay, I see it. Let me get this organized so I can watch it while I'm presenting.
Yeah, it should be at the top of the participant list.
Yep, I got it.
Cool.
Thank you. Okay. How we looking? That good?
Yep.
All right, cool. Well, thanks everybody for coming back to see me again. Sorry about last week. Time zones are hard, as Dom said, so apologize about that, but we're here today, excited to be presenting for you. I'll be presenting tips and tricks for Next.js and Sitecore Headless. So the idea for this talk is I'm just going to present a series of tips and tricks, things you can do with your Sitecore JSS, Next.js projects, and hope that you can take these tips and apply them to your project right away. So a little bit about me. I'm an independent consultant in the United States. I 8-time Sitecore MVP of Technology. I've got over 9 years of Sitecore experience. I live in Atlanta, Georgia. Happy dad to a toddler who's about to enter the terrible twos. So maybe next time I give this presentation, I won't be a happy dad. We'll see. I'm a lawn care and smooth jazz enthusiast. So if you're into lawn care or smooth jazz, reach out on Slack at Sitecore. I'm hanging out there all the time, and my website is coreysmith.co. Every Friday at 12:15 p.m. Eastern Time, I host Sitecore Lunch with my good friend and fellow Sitecore MVP, Jim Patillo. Sitecore Lunch is just a virtual meetup where the Sitecore community gets together on Zoom and we talk about Sitecore, but more often than not, we don't talk about Sitecore. We talk about any other topics that Jeremy Davis decides to bring up. So if you want to join us and hear Jeremy talk, we meet every single Friday, 52 weeks a year, 12:15 p.m. Eastern Time. I post the details in the Sitecore Slack general channel at exactly 12:15 on Fridays. And if you're not in the Sitecore Slack, please join us at sitecore.chat. Hope to see you tomorrow. And with that, let's get started with our first tip. Our first tip is going to be looking at debug logging. So Sitecore's Next.js SDK ships with pretty extensive debug logging. It's provided by an NPM package called debug. By the way, I won't be watching chat too closely, but if like my mic cuts out or anything, please speak up and let me know over audio. But yeah, so the Next.js SDK from Sitecore, it ships with pretty extensive debug logging from an npm package called debug. And when it's enabled, it will output tons of handy information in your server console and in the browser. So here's an example of that. When you turn on debug logging, layout service requests, dictionary service requests, anything like that will get printed out to the console to help you kind of diagnose issues with your application. It's really handy. And it's easy to turn on. So this functionality is hiding in plain sight in every Next.js application from Sitecore. If you go into the .env file, you'll see this block of commented out text. All you have to do to turn on debug logging is just uncomment this line right here. And this will turn on all the debug logs that Sitecore has made available in their applications. But if you want to kind of drill down to a specific type of log, say just for the layout service, then you can uncomment this line here. And this will filter out everything except for the layout service logs. But the debug package is actually quite a bit more sophisticated. If you wanted, you could uncomment this line here, and you can show all of the debug logs from Sitecore except for the layout service. So you can really tweak this to drill in and hone in on exactly what you need to look at and diagnose issues with. So again, all these are, if you've got a Next.js application from Sitecore, all of these are there in the .env file for you to explore. One thing that you won't see that I highly recommend you turn on is this right here. So I recommend that in your .env file, anytime you use debug logging, that you add this debug underscore multiline equals true. And what this is going to do is make your debug logs a lot more readable. So if you don't turn this on, your debug logs will look like this when you enable them, right? It's all kind of smushed together, hard to parse. But when you set debug multiline equals true, kind of spreads things out a bit and makes it a little bit easier to understand. I prefer this view myself. I always turn that on. We talked about the debug filters. Sitecore's got a ton of them out of the box. This is a comprehensive list. So if you want to turn on all the debug loggers, all you have to do is use the Sitecore JSS star namespace. If you want to look at just the data fetchers, which we'll look at here shortly, then you can turn on the HTTP namespace. They've got filters for layout service, dictionary service, the editing host. So editing host is good if you're trying to diagnose issues with pages or the experience editor. If you're working with headless SXA, they've got filters for the sitemap service, site info service, robot service. And if you're using CDP or personalized, there are even filters for those too. We looked at a couple of screenshots of the debug logging on the server, but you can actually turn on debug logging in the browser as well, though the process is slightly different. So if you want to see debug logs in the server, you go and uncomment those lines in your .env file. But if you want to see the debug logs in the browser, then what you have to do is you open up the browser console and you set the debug property on local storage to the filter that you want to see. So yeah, you just do this in your browser console, and then when you do that, any debug logs that get triggered during client-side interactions will start showing up in your browser logs like this. Now, if you go and turn this on in your browser on like a vanilla Next.js application, you're not going to see anything come up in the browser console. Don't be alarmed. That's because by default, almost all of the debug logs are triggered during server-side interactions and during server-side generation, so you won't see anything in the browser. But we're going to come back to this, and I'll show you how you turn this on and start making use of this. So to recap, you can enable debug logging for the server in your .env file. Make sure that you set debug multiline equals true for better readability. Debug multiline equals true, I think, only applies to the server. It doesn't actually help the browser, if I recall correctly. But if you want to turn on debug logging in the browser, you just set that debug property on local storage in the browser console. And in fact, so Sitecore's got all of these Sitecore JSS namespaces for their debug logging. But if you want to create your own spaces, your own namespaces and your own filters, you can actually do that using that debug package. And to learn more about that, go check out the debug documentation on the npm.js website. It covers how you can make your own namespaces and filters and a whole lot more. And then, of course, Sitecore's got some really good documentation on debug logging and all the filters that they have available. So that's tip number 1. Tip number 2, we're going to look at the JSS data fetchers. So the Sitecore JSS library exports 3 fetchers that you can use in your application for making HTTP requests or GraphQL calls. Those 3 fetchers that they make available to you are the native data fetcher, the Axios data fetcher, and the GraphQL request client. The Axios data fetcher, I just recommend don't even worry about it. I'm calling it out here for completeness. Really, if you need to make just a generic HTTP call, I recommend that you use the native data fetcher. The reason for that is the native data fetcher is a fancy wrapper from Sitecore around fetch. Vercel, the creators of Next.js, they actually have their own implementation of fetch in their Next.js applications that they are adding features to over time. So some of the things that they've started adding to fetch are things like request deduplication and caching. And if you use the native data fetcher, you'll get those features for free. Axios, you don't get those things. So if you're just making generic HTTP calls, you can use the native data fetcher. However, if you need to make a GraphQL call back to Sitecore for like the site info service or any of the Sitecore APIs, you'll want to use the GraphQL request client. The reason for that, the GraphQL request client actually has special handling for rate limiting and retry logic that makes working with the Sitecore APIs a little bit easier. But the reason to use any of this is because under the hood, they all implement debug logging. So when you use these and you start using that HTTP filter that I talked about earlier with debug logging, your requests through these will get logged for you automatically. So that's really nice. These are quite easy to use. So if you want to use the native data fetcher, all you have to do is just import it and new up an instance of the native data fetcher. And from that point on, if you've used fetch, the interface for making HTTP calls with the native data fetcher are quite similar. It's nothing tricky there. So yep, just do the import and then make your fetch call. Like I said, the nice thing about these data fetchers is they all implement debug logging. So if you want to see debug logs for these data fetchers, you just go and set Sitecore JSS HTTP in your .env file. Again, always turn on debug multiline equals true. And then you'll start seeing the requests and the responses show up in your server console for any calls made through those data fetchers. That'll look just like this. Again, if you want to see these calls happen in your browser, if you want to see the debug logging there, just set the debug property on local storage to the Sitecore JSS HTTP filter. And then if you're using these data fetchers inside of a use effect, for example, then you'll start seeing those get printed out to the browser console anytime they're triggered here. So to recap, use the native data fetcher instead of fetch. You probably won't need it, but if you prefer Axios for some reason, you can use the Axios data fetcher instead of Axios. Anytime that you're calling the Sitecore GraphQL APIs, use the GraphQL request client. And the nice thing about all these is that they have debug logging implemented, so better diagnostics. Okay, tip number 3 is looking at component level data fetching. So we're going to be looking at server-side data fetching techniques. So we'll start this by looking at a typical data fetching scenario in React. This is a React component that's using useState and useEffect to make an API call. And if you've had to make an API call in a React component, you've probably used this pattern. This is the standard data fetching pattern. You declare state using useState like this, and then you actually make your API call inside of the useEffect hook. And once your API call finishes, you set the state. This will trigger a re-render of your component when the data comes back from the API. And from that point in your component, maybe while the data is loading, you might show a loader. And then once the component re-renders with the actual data back from your API call, then you render that data. Like I said, this is a standard pattern. Nothing tricky here. It's kind of kludgy. The biggest problem with it, though, is use effect. So the use effect hook only executes on the client and in the browser. It never executes during server-side rendering. So the result of that is you're going to have loaders on your website, right? When your users first navigate to your page, all the components that are having use effect make API calls for them are going to have a flash of unstyled or a flash of content. There's going to be the loader, and then once the data comes back from the API, the component's going to have to re-render and show that data. It's not the best user experience, and it can have negative impacts on SEO for your site. The cool thing is that Next.js actually has a solution for this, but it's at the page level, not at the component level. And Next.js solution comes in the form of two special methods. One of them is called get static props, and the other is get server-side props. So these are, again, special methods from Next.js that are server-side data fetching methods you can use to do data fetching during server rendering, because, again, use effect doesn't execute during server-side rendering. If your application is using static site generation, SSG, you use get static props. Or if you want to use server-side rendering, SSR, you would use get server-side props. So let's take a look at an example. So again, we're looking at just the vanilla Next.js implementation of these functions right now. And in a standard Next.js application, the way that you use these is you export either get static props or get server-side props alongside your page. So you can see here, I'm just exporting a get static props function. And inside of that get static props, you can do your fetches. And then once the data comes back from your fetch call, for example, you just return it from your get static props function. And Next.js is magically going to take this data and during server-side rendering, pass it as a prop to your page. And then from your page, you can pass it down to all of your components. So this is really cool because this finally gives us a way to make API calls during server-side rendering. It'll improve SEO, and we can avoid the content flash. However, the big problem with this is, again, that you have to declare this at the page level. So if you imagine that your page has a bunch of components on it, and all those components rely on API calls, then at the page level, you have to know ahead of time which components are going to need API calls and make all those API calls from the page, right? And maybe in a vanilla Next.js application, that's okay because the pages are more static and you know ahead of time which components are going to be on the page. But in a Sitecore application, our pages are generally just a placeholder and they're completely dynamic from that point. The content authors are the ones who are deciding what goes on the page. So to make an API call at the page level for all possible components that our content authors are going to use would be quite wasteful. The cool thing is that the JSS team actually has a solution for this and allows us to declare this get static props and get server-side props function, not only at the page level, but also at the component level, so that it only executes for the components that are going to get rendered on the page. Let's take a look at an example. So going back to our component from before, nothing fancy here. We're just using that combo of the use state and use effect hooks to make an API call. And then we've got a loader that we render conditionally based on whether or not our API data is back. We can very easily refactor this component in a JSS application to take advantage of that server-side loading of API calls. And it would look like this. So now in a JSS application, we can actually export get server-side props or get static props alongside not only a page, but also our components. And so here I've got my component, and right alongside my component, I just export get server-side props, and the JSS framework will handle automatically calling this for me during server-side rendering. So here at the component, my component depends on a call to the cat fact API. And then from this function, I just return whatever data I get back from the API. and the Sitecore JSS framework will handle passing this down to the component that needs it, and then I can render it. No need for a loader here because this is all going to get generated during server-side rendering. So this is really cool because, again, only the components that are going to render on the page will have these functions called. And if we go back to our screenshot from before, there's no animation to show here because, yeah, there's no loading that's going to happen on the browser. It's just pure HTML getting served up to your users. It's quite nice. I really like this feature, but beware. If you're on a version of JSS before JSS 21.6.4, heed the warnings that I'm about to give you. If you're on this version or later, you don't have to worry about what I'm going to say. There's a big bug in JSS before 21.6.4. The bug is this. Page level get static props and get server side props are excluded from the code that gets sent to your browser. They're excluded from the client bundle, and that makes sense. These functions are for server side rendering, so there's no reason to send them to the browser. They're only going to execute on the server. One benefit to that, and something that Vercel actually advocates for in the Next.js documentation, is that since these functions only execute on the server, you can make direct database calls. So you can include connection strings in these functions. You can have API secrets in them. Whatever, it's okay because it's only going to execute on your code or on your server. It's not going to be sent up to the browser. So secrets, passwords, anything are fair game in these functions for you to do your server-side rendering. However, before JSS 21.6.4, the component level get static props and get server-side props are not excluded from the client bundle. So if you export one of those functions alongside your components and you put a connection string in them, or you put an API secret or whatever, it's going to go to the browser. So you might want to go and do audits of your applications if you're using this functionality and ensure that there's no sensitive data in the component level get static props or get server-side props functions. If you do have instances of that in your application, you need to go ahead and consider those API secrets, connection strings, passwords, whatever, compromised, because they're available in the browser. Anybody can see them in plain text. So yeah, if you're on a version before 21.6.4, highly recommend that you upgrade as soon as you can if you want to take advantage of this functionality. If you can't upgrade to 21.6.4 or later, just be mindful of this limitation. I still think that there's a lot of value in using these functions to get the server-side rendering functionality for your components, and also keep the server-side rendering code for your components close to the components that actually need them, because having to go and like have a giant function for your page, I don't think that's very clean for code. So to recap, you want to use get static props or get server-side props in your components. If you're on a version of JSS before 21.6.4, make sure that you upgrade as soon as you can. And if you can't upgrade to 21.6.4 or higher, then just make sure that you don't put any kind of sensitive data in your component level get static props or get server-side props functions. So here's some further reading for those. Here's a link to the 21.6.4 release if you're curious to see how the JSS team fixed that issue. Here's also a link to the issue that I raised on GitHub when I found this and brought it to the attention of the JSS team. Sitecore's got some really good documentation on component level data fetching that you can read, and then Vercel's got nice documentation on the page level data fetching that you can check out there. So check out all of this. And for this tip, we are going to switch from data fetching on the server to data fetching in the client. So going back to our example from before, anytime you're making an API call in a React component, you're going to use that combo of the use state and the use effect hooks. You declare the use state hook, or you use the use state hook to declare some state. And then in the use effect hook, you're going to make your API call, and you'll update the state when your API call finishes. You might show a loader while the API call data is unavailable, and then once the API call finishes, you'll actually show the data. So this works. This is the standard way, but there's an even better and cleaner way to do this. And one of those ways is using a library called SWR. So SWR, as you can see in this graphic, is a React hook for data fetching. SWR is a library that's developed by Vercel, and SWR stands for stale while revalidate. So let's take a look at how you use this. It's quite easy. Instead of having to use 2 hooks, you only have to use 1 hook now, and it's this hook called use SWR. So the first thing that you pass to it is just the URL that you want to get data from, and then the next thing that you pass to it is a generic data fetcher function, and this just tells SWR how you actually want it to go get the data. You can use the JSS data fetchers here. You can use fetch, Axios, whatever. And then what this hook is going to do is it's going to return a whole bunch of useful things to you. One of them is a Boolean is loading that indicates whether or not the API call is executing. If there's an error, it'll return an error object. And then once the data is actually loaded, it'll return that in the data object. So I think semantically, this is a lot cleaner because now instead of like looking at whether state is null or not to determine whether to show a loader, you actually have an is loading variable that you can pivot based on to show your loader, and then the data is available in that data object that comes back from your API. So I think this is a lot cleaner than having to use that combo of use state and use effect. But clean code is not the only reason to use this. SWR comes with a whole host of features that you get for free. It has an auto refetching feature, request deduplication. It's very good at setting up dependent queries. So if you have API calls that depend on each other, it's got good patterns for that. It can do prefetching and caching, supports pagination and infinite scroll, and it's got TypeScript support. So let's take a look at 2 of these cool features in action. So here I've got a page that's got that component on it that's calling the CatFact API. So the first thing to note is that the CatFact API, every time you make a request to it, it's just going to give you a random fact about cats. So what I've got going on here is I'm just clicking inside and out of the browser and making the browser lose focus. And you'll notice that every time I click in and out of the browser, we get a new cat fact. So that's the auto refetching feature that you get for free when you use SWR. You don't even have to do anything. You use that hook and this feature is automatically kicked in. It's probably the first thing you'll notice when you start using it, because you'll switch tabs and your API data will be fresh. So this is really cool just to make sure that your users always have the latest data from their APIs. There's another thing happening here that's a bit more subtle. So I mentioned request deduplication is one of the features, and that's what's going on here. If you use that use state and use effect hook like I described before, you would see a different cat fact for every instance of this component on the page, right? But when you use SWR, it's actually smart enough to see, hey, I've got multiple components on the page right now that are calling the same API. And SWR will actually just deduplicate those calls and make the call once and share the response across all the components. And again, you don't even have to do anything special for this. This is a feature that you just get for free. So yeah, it's really nice performance increase if that's something that would benefit your application. I mentioned this briefly before, but when you're working with SWR, you provide it a generic data fetcher function. That data fetcher function can use the native data fetcher from JSS like this. And if you do that, then you get debug logging for free. So here we're passing the fetcher function. It's using the native data fetcher. And then from this point, anytime you use the SWR hook and you turn on debug logging in the browser, you'll start seeing those requests show up here in the console log when you turn on that HTTP filter. So yeah, here's the request and the response that's getting made. Another cool thing about SWR, they've got a browser extension that you can use to inspect the history for SWR in your application. You can look into its cache. You can look at the network calls. So that's really handy for debugging issues with your app. And so to recap, SWR simplifies and supercharges data fetching code, but it's not the only game in town. There's actually another really nice library called React Query that's a great alternative to SWR. I've used React Query on projects before with great success, and really it just comes down to your team's preference, and I recommend that you check both of those out. So here's Purcell's documentation on SWR. If you're interested in the dev tools, there's the link to that, and highly recommend that you check out React Query if you're not using any kind of data fetching library in your application already. All right, tip number 5, we are going to combine the previous 2 tips to look at how we can provide mock data in Pages and the Experience Editor. So when we're developing an application for Sitecore, we're really developing 2 applications. We're, of course, developing the application or the website that our end users are going to see, but we're also developing an application for our content authors to build pages in XM Cloud Pages in the Experience Editor. And something that I want to stress when you're building applications for the Experience Editor and Pages is that Pages in the Experience Editor are for designing layouts. They're not for testing APIs. So when you're in Pages in the Experience Editor, I advocate that you should never be making API calls, that instead in these 2 experiences, you should be serving up mock data in your components just to give your content authors a representative idea of what the component's going to look like on the page, but don't actually make live API calls. The biggest reason for this is that React re-renders or any kind of client-side rendering can break the Experience Editor, and it can mess up Pages as well. So let's look back at our cat fact example. So I've kind of reconfigured our component from before that's making a client-side API call. And what I've got it doing is, while our API call is loading, I show a loader, just a single div. But once the API call is finished loading, then we show the data from the API. But the most problematic thing here is that we're rendering an image field from Sitecore using the image field helper, and we're rendering a placeholder. If you block or do conditional loading of any of the Sitecore field helpers or the placeholders, you will definitely break the Experience Editor. This is an anti-pattern. The kind of things that you'll see from doing this are that inline editing won't work on your fields. The component, when you first insert it into the Experience Editor, it won't render, or your placeholders just straight up will not work. Anytime you try to use a placeholder like that, you'll get a message that says could not find the rendering in the HTML loaded from the server. So again, this is why I stress don't do conditional rendering of those kind of things, and don't make API calls in the Experience Editor or Pages. So I would like from this point to show you an alternative that you can use to serve up mock data and avoid these kind of issues. So here's our component. It's making a client-side API call for a cat fact, and it shows a loader while that API call is executing. We can very easily refactor this component to always serve up mock data in the Experience Editor and Pages, and this is what it would look like. This looks like a lot of code, but it's really not. Let's just break it down and kind of dive in. The first thing that we're doing alongside our component is we're exporting get server-side props or get static props. And then inside of that function, we first look at whether or not we're in Experience Editor or Pages. If we're not in Experience Editor or Pages, just return, don't do anything. We want our API calls to execute normally, because conditional rendering outside of Experience Editor or Pages is okay. But if we are inside of Experience Editor or Pages, then just return some mock data. Okay, so we've got our mock data set up for our component. That'll get passed down to the component by JSS. And then with SWR, you can take advantage of a feature called fallback data and provide your mock data to that fallback data property. What this tells SWR is, while my API call is loading, instead of returning null for my data, provide this fallback data. So this gives us a way to inject data into mock data into SWR to use while the API call is loading. But like I said, when we're in Experience Editor or Pages, we don't want API calls executing at all. So the next thing to do is to go and turn off SWR's fetching functionality and make it so that it always returns fallback data in the Experience Editor and in Pages. And that's quite easy to do as well. To do that, you would just go to your topmost level component in your application, probably your page, and on the page, you include an SWR config element like this. On that SWR config element, what you'll do is you'll just set revalidate on focus and revalidate on mount to false when you are in the Experience Editor or Pages. And basically what this tells SWR is when we're in Experience Editor or Pages, don't make API calls. If there's fallback data available, always return that. And so I think that's a really clean pattern to serve up mock data when you're in those editing experiences, but still keep your normal application flow outside. So to recap, don't make API calls or do conditional rendering in Pages or the Experience Editor because client-side re-rendering of the JSS field helpers and placeholders will definitely break the Experience Editor. You can use get server-side props and get static props to return API mock data for editing. Another really cool feature of that, especially if you're in the latest version of JSS, is since get server-side props and get static props get excluded from the client bundle, you don't ever have to worry about your mock data making it up to the browser. So that's really nice. You can use SWR's fallback data to consume the mock data from those functions. And just remember to turn off the API calls in Experience Editor and Pages by disabling revalidate on mount and revalidate on focus. Okay, the last 4 tips were pretty extensive. Let's take a break and do an easy one. This one, again, is another tip about working in XM Cloud and Pages and the Experience Editor, and this one is always define a root element. So this is a problem that is not actually unique to Next.js or React. This applies to all rendering frameworks, all the way back to XSLT, Web Forms, MVC. They all share this issue. The idea is that you must always wrap your components that are going to get used in the Experience Editor in a single, just one real root element. So in a React application, I often see this fragment getting used to simulate a single root element, but this won't work. If you build your components like this in React and expose them in the Experience Editor, you're going to have problems. Things that'll happen, styles will get broken, inline editing, again, won't work properly on insert, and placeholders won't work properly if they're not inside of a single real root element. So instead, always make sure that your components in your Next.js applications have a single div or a single span or some real element wrapping the entire component. And if you do this, your content authors will be so happy you won't have problems, or at least problems caused by this. And I think that this is probably a good opportunity for someone to develop an ESLint or Prettier plugin, because I feel like this is something that could be detected statically through linting. But yeah, just make sure your components always have a real root element. The next tip is to disable Next.js telemetry. This is an easy one too. So Vercel, they collect a lot of telemetry from your Next.js server to further improve the product, of course. But if you or your clients are privacy focused, then you can turn this off very easily. In your Next.js env file, all you have to do is set next telemetry disabled to 1. You check this into Git, and you're done. The next telemetry will be turned off in your Next server. Sitecore's got documentation for this, and I think they recommend this approach as well. Vercel's got some more extensive documentation justifying their telemetry, and they also provide other methods that I think are a bit more complicated to disable it, but you can check out both of those. For this step, we'll look at a feature in the Sitecore Next.js SDK that will help you with upgrades of your SDK, and that's config plugins. So in the root of your Next.js application, there is a next.config.js file where you set all of your configuration for Next.js. The next config.js that comes with the new Sitecore application has a bunch of stuff configured already for you. The things that you can set in that file are like the distribution directory. You can set environment variables, headers, do image configuration, redirects and rewrites. You can do Webpack configuration there. And that's great. If you need to modify these things for your application, by all means do it. Just don't do it directly in the next config.js file, because Sitecore actually gives you a nice modular way to modify the next config.js without making changes to that file. And that comes in the form of config plugins. So this is kind of like the advice back in the .NET days of Sitecore, where we say don't modify the web config directly, do web config transforms. Config plugins are kind of the same thing. So the way that you use these is you just go create a new file in the source lib next config plugins folder of your application. If you open that up on your application, you'll see that there are already a lot of plugins that Sitecore has developed that you can use as a template. But your plugins will always take this form that I've shown here. And yeah, working inside where I've got that comment set next config.js settings here, that's setting your settings there is just like setting your settings in the next config.js file. And again, this is very similar to creating a config patch in Sitecore or a web config transform. So say, for example, that you want to turn off the powered by header that the Next.js server sends on all responses. Instead of modifying the next config.js file, you can just go create a script called powered by header.js inside of that plugins folder and set powered by header to false here in your config plugin. And now next time you build or run your Next.js application, this plugin will get combined with the next config and the powered by header won't be turned on. So this is a bit of a contrived example, but if you imagine that you've got a feature in your application that needs rewrites, it needs redirects, maybe it needs some Webpack configuration, instead of going in your next config.js file and having those settings for your feature like strewn about in the next config.js file, it's quite nice just being able to put them all in a single plugin for your feature and keep that code together. So this results in a lot cleaner code as well. Just remember that anytime you create or change a plugin that you've actually got to rebuild your application, they don't get picked up by hot module reload. So you'll have to run next build or restart your rendering host container. To recap, don't edit your next config.js directly. You can change the Next.js settings instead with config plugins that you put in the plugins folder. And just always remember to rebuild your app after creating or modifying plugins. All right, tip number 9, this is Next.js Bundle Analyzer. This will help you get a better understanding of your website payloads. So to use the bundle analyzer, the first thing that you're going to do is npm install Next Bundle Analyzer like this. And this will get the package inside of your application. And then the next thing you'll do is you'll create a config plugin. So in that plugins folder, add bundleanalyzer.js. And you can use this exactly as I've got screenshotted here. The key things to call out, inside of your plugin, you will enable bundle analyzer based on the analyze environment variable when that's set to true. And another thing that you'll want to set is open analyzer to false. If you set open analyzer to true, every time your application reloads, it's going to open up new tabs in your browser, and you'll very quickly fill your entire screen with tabs from bundle analyzer. It's an annoying feature, just turn it off by default. So you've got that config plugin in place. You go into your environment variables, set analyze to true, and then when your application reloads, bundle analyzer will generate a couple of HTML pages, one for the client side bundle at that path at the top, and then one for the server side bundle at the path at the bottom. The client side bundle page looks like this. So it breaks up it shows squares for all of your chunks that get sent up to the browser. So there's a chunk for the main.js file, there's a chunk for the 404 page, for your catch-all page route, and then one for the app. And if you look inside of these, you can see that node modules generally takes up most of the space. Your components themselves, they only get included in the 404 and the path bundles. They don't take up as much space as node modules does, but that's kind of hard to see. So you can open up the side panel and you can zoom in on these chunks individually if you like. So here's the page route when it's zoomed in. Again, you can see that node modules is actually contributing the most to the bundle size. Sitecore JSS libraries contribute quite a bit of space. And then here are your components on the side, of course. And any of these squares you can mouse over and it'll tell you exactly how many kilobytes it's contributing to the bundle size. The server page looks quite a bit different. So you can see here, one of the things that you'll notice is there's on the server, this document.js that gets included in the bundle that's not, that wasn't included in the client-side bundle. And again, that's because the document.js is only executed during server-side rendering. So this doesn't get included up in the client bundle. So to recap, you can use Next.js Bundle Analyzer to diagnose your bundle sizes. Really good for finding code that doesn't belong in the browser and easy to enable with a config plugin. Vercel's got some good documentation on that here. Our final tip is probably my favorite. This is patch package. So if you've ever had a scenario where you've needed to patch node modules, you need to go and make a change to something inside of there, maybe export a type that's not available, patch package will let you do that. To get started, you just run npm install patch package like this. And then you add a post install script to your package.json. And this is just going to tell your application or npm, after running npm install, always call patch package to patch the node modules folder. From that point, you can go into your node modules folder and you can start making changes. So this is the is-even package that's included in probably every application on the planet. You can just open up node modules, go to is-even index.js and make a change. So if you really wanted to mess with your team, you could make is-even always return true on Mondays. And then if you want to share this with your team, once you make this change directly in the node modules folder, you switch over to your terminal and run npx patch package is-even, or whatever module you modified. And what patch package will do from that point is it's going to go and actually download a clean copy of is-even, and it's going to compare it to the version of is-even in your node modules folder and generate a patch file. That patch file will get created in the patches folder of your repo. And then from that point, you can check it into Git and share it with your team. Anytime you create a patch like this, I highly recommend that you follow this command to go and create an issue on the repo for the maintainer, because this is something that the maintainer needs to know about. There might be a type that they forgot to export or some bug that you're fixing that probably everyone else can benefit from. This is what the patch will look like inside of your patches folder. And again, you'll just check this into Git. And then once this is checked in the future, when npm install is run on your repo, patch package will get run after the npm install finishes, and it'll apply your patches to the node modules folder. And this will work for anyone locally. It'll work in your build process, etc. I will say, just make sure that you use this sparingly. This is a powerful tool that can be easily abused. If you find bugs in packages, you need to be reporting them to the maintainers. But let's be realistic. There are instances where you just need to fix stuff in your node modules folder or export a type that's not available. Or for example, if you're on an old version of JSS and you want to patch that issue that I talked about earlier, where get static props and get server-side props methods actually get included in the client bundle, you could use patch package to fix those on an older version of JSS without upgrading. So to recap, You can use patch package to modify node modules. The packages get created in the patches folder in your repo, and just make sure that you use this sparingly. Documentation for patch package is available here. And from this point, I think we've got a few minutes for questions. I will open up chat. Let's see.
Thanks, Corey. Yeah, if you look in chat, I was going to say you might want to read them and give your response to them. Some of them are quite detailed. You can potentially as well unmute the part.
Let's see. I'm looking at Ricardo's question. He says last year they had to put on hold the refactoring of their current solution in Next.js because the JSS application was not able to talk with the CMS. Talk means that the Sitecore links between the MVC application and the JSS application were not resolved correctly by Sitecore. So this sounds like an issue between trying to get a JSS and MVC application to work together, yes?
Does sound specific. You might be able to get one if you unmute him.
Is that correct at in the chat at the bottom?
Yeah.
I'm gonna skip this one because this is a bit more complex, and I'll come back to this. Alex has got a question on component level data fetching. Let's see. Yeah, component level data fetching would be useful for any dynamic page headless CMS. Do you know if Vercel has ever considered implementing this natively? No, I don't know if they're going to implement this natively or not. Vercel is usually at Sitecore Symposium and SugCon, so you could ask them there. I do know that this is asked about a lot. Like if you go look on Stack Exchange, you'll see people asking if you can do this. And yeah, I don't know. You could always, since JSS is open source, you could go and look at how the JSS team implemented it and put this in a regular Next.js application if you like.
Yeah, I'm quite surprised. I do like the fact that the Sitecore's approach to it is they seem to be trying to, as much as they can, fit in with the Next.js way of doing things.
Yeah.
So when they're changing things, they're trying to make it like, well, if you already know how to use this, then this is going to make sense to you rather than a completely different way. But yeah, I was quite surprised, or even if it's not Vercel, if there's not a well-used library out there, because it seems to me like it'd be such a common thing to want to do. So I'm glad it's in here. It's just interested if you happen to know.
No, but I think it's a great feature.
Mm.
We've got a question. Is there any documentation of all methods exposed by the Sitecore JSS Next.js package? Not that I'm aware of. You could probably go ask ChatGPT though, and give it the exports from that package. It could tell you. Are there any of these features affected by your choice of head host? No, I don't think so. Let's see. Oh, I don't think any of these features should be affected by your head host. I mean, the only thing I can think is like you can't use get server side props if you're doing static SSG, for example, or if you're doing a static export of your site. Any of these features that depend on a Next.js server being present, they won't work. Adam saving the day with I'm
not
some
sure
good documentation.
If that's correct or not, but that's if you follow some convoluted links, you eventually end up there. And,
Thank you.
Yeah, it basically gives you an overview of all of the, from what I can tell, the methods and props and so on as well.
So Ricardo, yes, it is possible to run JSS apps alongside MVC applications in a Sitecore, in a single Sitecore instance. I've got a client doing that right now, so that's definitely supported. It sounds like your questions are around cross-site linking, so trying to do links back to your MVC site from your JSS app and to your JSS app from your MVC site. I've not had a requirement to do that, so I'm not sure. I mean, seems to me like it should work, but there's always some tricks with the link builder. Login sessions, I mean, that's going to get pretty hairy because with Next.js, there's not going to be any kind of native access to the .NET session, right? So you'd probably have to write your own APIs to get access to that, I would imagine. For application insights, yes, you can turn on application insights for a JSS application. That is definitely supported. I'm not sure if Sitecore has some documentation on that or not, but it is definitely supported. I've turned it on before.
So we've got a couple of minutes left. If anyone wants to fire any more quick questions in the chat, please do. My only takeaway, because obviously I'm not too technical on my side, but I think it's point 5 about you mentioned about the put mock data in the content editor. I was like, I fully back that one up, because I normally work with the content editors, and if things are missing, it throws them, and then normally on the phone to devs straight away. So having that built is spot on. And then when you talked about live editing of config files, I had nightmares, flashbacks for nightmares anyway, from about 10, 15 years ago, back in the day when I loved doing that. So yeah, that's been really, really, really helpful. Jason's just dropped in a question.
So the version of Next.js used by JSS, it differs based on the version of JSS that you're using. The latest version of JSS I believe uses Next.js 14.1. I will say that they don't have official support for the app router yet, though. So that's kind of the big rage in the Next.js community right now. Everybody wants to use app router. You're still stuck, even on the latest version of Next.js that JSS is using, you're still stuck with the page router for now, officially.
I've got a few more other questions coming too.
Question about the Sitecore API keys for different environments. You can definitely have different API keys for different environments. Vercel would be good, sure. It's a good host. I mean, that's what Sitecore recommends, particularly for XM Cloud. But it's pricey, so it's just going to come down to your client's budget. But if that's an option available to you, yeah, absolutely. Netlify is another good alternative. I've got a client running their Next.js application in Azure.
Brilliant. I think we'll leave it there then. If you got any other questions, obviously there's Corey's details all in front of you on the screen, so reach out to him direct. That's been really helpful, and it just reminds again that we've got that meetup in August the 14th, I want to say. But yeah, thank you very much, Corey, for coming twice, not just one.
Well, one time.
Yeah. But it's been
thanks everyone
helpful, and obviously a lot of people have enjoyed it too. So yeah, thank you very much.
Thanks all.
Yeah,
appreciate it.
Corey.
That was excellent. Thanks, Corey.
Yeah, thank you very much, Corey.
Good evening.